When I was 12 years old, I saw a woman in a white dress waving at me from the window of my bedroom. When I entered the house, I realized I was alone. My mother, as a child, had seen the same figure in the same window, something she could never explain. It was a hot summer afternoon in a small town in the United States. The scars of time marked the houses, but tranquility reigned in the streets. I was 12 years old, and back then, afternoons were long and full of adventures. However, one particular afternoon was forever marked in my memory. While biking back home, something caught my eye. As I approached our old house, I saw a figure in the distance at the window of my bedroom on the second floor. A woman. She was dressed in a long white dress, old-fashioned, almost out of place, and she waved slowly. Her movements were strange, almost ethereal, as if she were floating. At that moment, a wave of discomfort ran down my spine. Who could she be? I wondered, unsure if I should be more curious or scared. I sped up and ran up the porch stairs. As I opened the front door, the silence of the house enveloped me. I called out for my mother, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. The house was empty, something I already knew instinctively, but needed to confirm. I slowly climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to remember if I had left anyone home that morning. When I reached my room, I found the window slightly open, the hot summer air blowing in waves. The woman was gone. I looked out at the yard, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The discomfort turned into a deep sense of fear, something I couldn't explain. I knew I had seen something, but what was it? Later that night, my mother returned from work. I sat with her in the kitchen, the sound of the kettle boiling in the background. I decided to tell her what I had seen, hoping she would laugh and say it was just my imagination. But her reaction was different. Her face paled, and she dropped the cup she was holding. For a moment, she seemed lost, her eyes fixed on some distant point. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I saw her too, when I was your age," she said. "A woman in white, at the same window." She told me that at the time, she believed it was just an optical illusion, maybe a trick of the light. But now, the coincidence was undeniable. She had never mentioned the experience before, thinking it was something insignificant, buried in the past. However, seeing the same figure years later, she began to doubt her sanity. I could see the fear in my mother's eyes. She had no answers, only unresolved memories that now returned to haunt her and me. That night, I went to bed with a sense of unease. I didn't know what was happening, but something was clearly wrong. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the image of the woman in white, but she kept coming back, like a ghost that refuses to disappear. The following days were worse. I started having nightmares about that woman, always appearing at the window, waving at me. What once seemed like a simple wave now felt like a call, some kind of sinister invitation to something unknown. My curiosity grew, so I started asking the older residents about the history of the house. I discovered that it had been built in the early 20th century and had belonged to several families, but no one knew of anything that would justify the apparition. At least, that's what they all said. One day, while exploring the dusty attic, I found an old diary, hidden in a forgotten box. The pages were fragile, yellowed by time, but the words were still legible. It belonged to a young woman named Eleanor, who lived in the house in the 1920s. Her entries spoke of a presence that disturbed her, especially at night. She mentioned a lady in white who watched her from afar, from the bedroom window. The last pages were filled with despair, with Eleanor writing about her fear that the lady was trying to tell her something, but she didn't know what it was. Later that night, I decided to put the diary away and go downstairs for dinner. As I descended the stairs, I heard a sound that made me stop, the ticking of a clock. But when I entered the living room, I realized the wall clock had stopped. The last time I had seen that clock working, it was exactly 3 p.m., the same time I had seen the woman in the window. For the last time that night, I looked at the clock, feeling a sense of déjà vu. When I looked out the window, I felt a chill. There she was again. The woman in white was waving at me, but this time, her gaze was more intense, as if she were waiting for something. I knew I wasn't dreaming this time. Something very real, and very old, was connected to that house, and somehow, it was connected to me too. The next morning, I was filled with a strange, almost obsessive determination. I needed to find out more about the woman in the window. I remembered Eleanor's diary and decided to search the attic again. This time, I found an old, yellowed photo of a woman standing by a window, the same window in my bedroom. She was dressed in white, with a vacant, distant look. It was as if her eyes were staring at me through time. I showed the photo to my mother, and her reaction was immediate. "It's her," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "That's the woman I saw when I was a child." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still many missing parts. What did that woman want? Why was she appearing now, so many years later? Determined to understand more about the house's history, I went next door to Mrs. Harper's house, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood forever. She opened the door with a gentle smile, but when I mentioned the woman in white, her expression changed drastically. "You saw her too?" she asked with a mix of fear and curiosity. "She's haunted that house before." According to Mrs. Harper, the woman in white was a known but rare presence. She appeared from time to time, always to the residents of our house, but no one knew who she was or what she wanted. Some believed she was a trapped spirit, unable to move on. Others said she was a warning, a harbinger of something terrible. Mrs. Harper, however, only advised, "Don't interact with her." Those who did were never the same again. Worried, my mother and I decided to seek out Father Collins, the local priest. He was known for dealing with supernatural events and had a reputation for being a wise man. When we mentioned the woman in white, he frowned. "Souls that can't find rest sometimes try to communicate," he said. "But the problem is, we don't always know what they want or why they're trapped." The priest suggested blessing the house, but he warned that this might not solve the problem. "If she's trapped for a strong reason, we'll need to find out why," he concluded. My mother agreed to bring the priest for a visit, but I felt that this wouldn't be enough. The woman in white seemed to want something specific from me. What could it be? That night, I returned to Eleanor's diary. I needed more clues. I recalled her words about the lady in white trying to show her something. There was a passage I had overlooked before. "Sometimes she appears with something in her hands. A key? An envelope? I can't see clearly, but I know it's important. I'm afraid to find out what it is." These words left me uneasy. What was the woman trying to show? And if this key, or whatever it was still in the house, perhaps it was something she wanted someone to find, something that tied her to the living world. The next day, I decided to search for this key. I scoured the entire house, focusing on places that seemed older, less touched by time. Finally, I found a small door hidden behind a panel in the attic wall. It was a tiny wooden door, almost invisible, and to my surprise, it was locked. I immediately remembered the key mentioned in the diary. Something was trapped behind that door, something that could be the key to understanding the mystery. But how would I open it? With no idea what to do, I started knocking on the door, hoping for some sign, but the silence that followed was deafening. That night, I went to bed exhausted but determined. I knew the woman in white would reappear. And, as expected, I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange sensation. I looked at the window, and there she was, clearer than ever. But this time, something was different. She was holding something in her hands. It looked like a key. She was waving, but also pointing to the attic, as if she were showing the way. I got out of bed with my heart racing. I knew that if I wanted to understand what was happening, I had to follow her. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to the attic, where the small locked door awaited me. When I got there, the woman had disappeared again, but the feeling of her presence was intense. As I examined the small door, I noticed an old, intricate lock. I didn't have the physical key, but I decided to try pushing the door with force. To my surprise, it gave way, as if it had been waiting for someone to open it. Inside, I found a small wooden box, carefully stored. When I opened it, there was a rusty key and a small sealed envelope. The envelope looked old, but intact. My heart pounded as I opened it, revealing a letter inside. The handwriting was elegant, dated decades ago. The letter was addressed to Eleanor and was written by a man named Thomas. He confessed a terrible secret, that he had betrayed Eleanor irreparably, and in her despair, she had taken her own life. The key, mentioned in the letter, was to a small box where Eleanor kept all her most cherished memories, but also her greatest sorrows. Thomas begged for Eleanor's forgiveness, but he knew that his betrayal had destroyed her. Now it all made sense. The woman in white, Eleanor, was trapped, unable to move on because of the pain she suffered. The key and the letter were the connection to the living world, and probably the only way to set her free. With the key in hand, I knew I had to open Eleanor's box to release her spirit. That night, I returned to the attic and used the key on the small box I had found. Inside were photos, small mementos, and at the bottom, a gold ring, the symbol of Thomas's betrayal. When I touched the ring, I felt a shiver, and a wave of deep sadness washed over me. The image of the woman in white appeared once more, but this time, she seemed more at peace, as if she were finally at rest. The letter and the key had fulfilled their purpose. But even with this sense of relief, I knew that something more was coming. The following days were surprisingly calm. The image of the woman in white no longer appeared, and both my mother and I began to believe that the mystery had finally been solved. We felt a peace that we hadn't experienced in a long time. The house seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. I went straight to my room, expecting to find the window empty, and this time, that's exactly what I saw, a simple pane of glass reflecting the night outside. But a part of me wasn't convinced. Something about the way it ended seemed incomplete, as if there was still a missing piece to the puzzle. One afternoon, as I was coming back from school, I found a white envelope left in the mailbox. It had no return address, just my name written in an old-fashioned handwriting, almost identical to Thomas's letter. I carefully opened it, and inside was a single piece of paper. "You're not done yet. Come alone to the old barn at midnight." The barn was an old, abandoned structure on the outskirts of town, a place no one had gone to in years. The message was clear but terrifying. Who could have sent it? And why? My mother was away that night, working late, which left me free to decide on my own. Part of me wanted to ignore the note, forget everything, and move on. But another part, the curious and stubborn part, knew I couldn't let this opportunity pass. I needed to understand what else was being hidden, what hadn't yet been revealed. As midnight approached, I grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, trying to prepare for the worst. The path to the barn was shrouded in dense, oppressive darkness, and each step made my heart beat faster. I arrived at the barn exactly at midnight. The place was in ruins, covered in ivy and almost collapsing, but the wooden door was strangely ajar. I entered slowly, lighting the way with the flashlight that trembled in my hand. The smell of mold and rotting wood filled the air, and the sound of footsteps softly echoed around me, though I knew I was alone. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. The silence that followed was absolute until a soft voice, almost a whisper, broke through the darkness. "You finally came." The voice came from all directions, reverberating through the empty space. The flashlight came back on, revealing the figure of a woman, but this time, it wasn't the woman in white. It was Eleanor, in her human form, like in the old photos. Her eyes were sad, but there was something else in them, a mix of urgency and desperation. She pointed to the center of the barn, where something was hidden under an old, dirty cloth. I lifted the cloth and found a small wooden box, different from the one I had found in the attic. Inside were more letters, but this time, they were written by Eleanor. They revealed a terrible secret. Thomas hadn't just betrayed Eleanor, he had murdered her, staging her suicide to cover up the crime. He stole her savings and fled, leaving her trapped between worlds, unable to rest until the truth was revealed. As I read the letters, Eleanor's anger and sadness were palpable, almost as if they were emanating from the pages. Her apparition began to disintegrate, as if the act of exposing the truth was finally allowing her to move on. But before she could disappear completely, she pointed at me, her eyes fixed, and said, "You need to make him pay." I realized then that Eleanor wasn't just asking for justice, she wanted revenge. Thomas had destroyed her life, and now, somehow, the responsibility for settling the score fell on me. I left the barn with my head spinning. The story I thought I had solved was much darker than I could have ever imagined. I decided that the only way to end this would be to confront Thomas, or what was left of him. He had moved to a nearby town years ago, and after some searching, I found the address. When I arrived at his house, I noticed it was a decrepit place, just like him. Thomas was now an elderly man, frail and haggard, living in seclusion. He no longer seemed like the monster Eleanor described, but even so, the anger in my chest burned. I entered the house unannounced, and Thomas, surprised, stood up from his chair, trying to understand who the stranger invading his home was. I didn't say a word, I just placed Eleanor's letters on the table in front of him. He looked at them and then at me, and in his eyes, I saw the recognition and terror forming. "Are you one of them?" he asked, his voice trembling. I didn't know exactly what he meant, but before I could respond, an invisible force took over the room. The letters rose up on their own and flew towards Thomas, surrounding him. He screamed, a mixture of panic and pain, as Eleanor's figure, now translucent and shrouded in shadows, emerged once more. Eleanor was not at peace, she was furious. Her spirit, fueled by the desire for revenge, hovered over Thomas as he begged for forgiveness, acknowledging his sins. But it was too late. The last thing I saw before leaving the house was Eleanor finally taking her revenge. The image of Thomas being tormented by the shadows he had created himself was burned into my mind. I left the house, not looking back. I left Thomas's house with a feeling of relief mixed with deep melancholy. Eleanor's revenge had been fulfilled, but the experience had left me scarred. I returned home in silence, the town streets deserted under the dim streetlights. I didn't know what to expect when I returned, but I felt that, somehow, everything was coming to an end. When I entered the house, the air felt different, lighter. The clock in the living room, which had stopped weeks ago, started ticking again, marking time once more. It was as if the disturbing presence that haunted our home had finally been expelled. I went straight to my room, expecting to find the window empty, and this time, that's exactly what I saw, a simple pane of glass reflecting the night outside. The next morning, my mother noticed the change. She found me in the kitchen, a look of relief on her face. "I don't know what you did," she said, "but it feels like everything's back to normal." I told her the truth, from the letters to the confrontation with Thomas. Her expression went from shock to understanding. "Maybe she was waiting for someone who had the courage to do what I didn't," she murmured. "Maybe she just wanted justice." The weight that had hung over us for all those days seemed to evaporate. It was a new beginning for us, without the shadow of the woman in white watching us. In the days that followed, peace finally reigned in our home. There were no more apparitions, no more nightmares, or disturbing vision. I began to feel that everything was resolved, that the dark chapter had finally been closed. However, one quiet night, something unexpected happened. I woke up in the middle of the night and felt a slight chill down my spine. I looked toward the window out of instinct, and for a brief moment, I saw a familiar figure. But this time, Eleanor didn't seem threatening or disturbed. She was there, at peace, smiling slightly, as if she were saying goodbye. In her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before, gratitude. And then, as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. I knew that would be the last time I saw her. Days later, I heard about Thomas's death. The newspaper said he died under mysterious circumstances, alone in his house. There was no in-depth investigation since he was an elderly man with few ties. But I knew what had happened. Eleanor had finally found peace, and Thomas had paid for his crimes. As the weeks went by, life returned to normal. What once seemed like a cursed house became a home again. My mother and I began to repair the emotional damage the past had left. We decided to sell the house and move to a new place, a place without terrifying memories, to start anew. While packing my things, I found Eleanor's diary again. This time, I carefully placed it in a box, knowing the story had ended. There was no longer any need to fear the past. Our new house was smaller, but cozy, and most importantly, it didn't carry any scary memories. It was an opportunity to start from scratch, and we embraced it with joy. My mother found a new job, and I started making new friends at school. The change of scenery did us both good. Sometimes, at night, I found myself thinking about Eleanor and what had happened. Her story still disturbed me, but in a different way. I was no longer afraid, just deeply empathetic for a soul that suffered so much and finally found peace. Even in the new house, echoes of the past still reached me occasionally. Sometimes, in dreams, I saw Eleanor, but now she was smiling, free from the pain that had held her for so long. I woke up with a strange sense of tranquility, knowing that the cycle had been closed. What happened in the old house became a part of who I was, a story I would never tell anyone but would always be with me. One night, months after the move, while I was finishing reading a book in bed, I heard a soft whisper, almost imperceptible, beside me. It seemed to say, "Thank you." I looked around, but the room was empty. A shiver ran down my spine, but not from fear, and instead from understanding. Life, even in its most unusual forms, always finds a way to balance itself. Life went on, and over time, Eleanor's memory faded, becoming just an old story I would tell myself in moments of reflection. I never saw the woman in white again, and I hope she finally found the peace she sought. For me, it was a lesson in how the past can reach us, but also in how we can find the strength to deal with it. Now, the window of my life is open to the future, and I'm ready for whatever comes. If you enjoyed this thrilling story and want to hear more incredible tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share with your friends. We have many other adventures that will tug at your emotions and challenge your imagination. Don't miss the upcoming stories. Join our community of explorers of mysteries and emotion. See you next time.